Stuart Pemberton looked at me across our dining room table, the one we'd bought together at an estate sale in Saanich 31 years ago, and laughed. "Alice," he said, setting down his wineglass with the kind of deliberateness that meant he'd been saving this sentence. "You wouldn't last 6 months without me." The room went quiet. My son Gavin stared down at his plate. My daughter-in-law Trina reached for her water glass and didn't let go of it. And in that silence, with the October rain tapping against the windows of our house in Oak Bay, I understood something I should have understood years earlier. I had spent 3 decades making myself smaller so that Stuart could feel larger. And the people sitting at my table were going to let him keep doing it. He slid the separation papers toward me 2 weeks later, with a look I had never seen from him before. Not anger, not grief, just certainty. He expected me to fall apart. Instead, I picked up the pen. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't have imagined, was that I had already found the one thing he could never take from me. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And please, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one. People always assume a marriage ends in a moment, a slammed door, a terrible fight that leaves the walls ringing, but mine ended the way a shoreline erodes. Gradually, quietly, one wave at a time, until one day you look down and realize the ground has disappeared entirely from beneath your feet. When I met Stuart Pemberton, I was 26 years old and working out of a rented studio space above a bookshop on Fort Street in Victoria. I wove. That was my whole life, back then. Textile art, floor looms, hand-dyed fibers, slow methodical work that required patience and imagination in equal measure. I sold pieces to galleries, took commissions, taught weekend workshops to women twice my age who reminded me of my grandmother. I wasn't wealthy, but I was whole. Stuart came in one afternoon looking for a birthday gift for his mother. He was 30 years old, already doing well in commercial real estate, and he had this particular way of filling a room. Confident without being loud, certain without being unkind. At least that was how it seemed then. He bought the most expensive piece in the studio. A wall hanging in indigo and cream that had taken me 3 months to finish. "This is extraordinary," he said, and the way he looked at me when he said it made me feel like he meant me, not the weaving. We married 14 months later. For a while, life was genuinely beautiful. We bought a Victorian house in Oak Bay, close enough to the ocean that you could smell the salt air on windy mornings. Stuart worked long hours, and I kept weaving, kept selling, kept building something I could call my own. Then our son Gavin was born, and everything shifted in the particular slow way it does when you're inside it, so gradual you don't recognize it as loss. It doesn't make financial sense to pay for childcare. Stuart told me when Gavin was 7 months old, "You're not bringing in enough to justify it. Stay home for now. You can always go back to it later." It sounded logical. Stuart was good at making things sound logical. I disassembled my loom and put it in the basement. That's the part that still catches in my throat, even now. Not the decision itself. I understood it, even agreed with it, but the act of taking the loom apart piece by piece, wrapping the beams in an old bedsheet, setting it against the wall like something I fully intended to return to. Later. I kept telling myself later. Later became years, years became decades. I did what needed doing. I drove Gavin to hockey practice at 6 in the morning. I organized Stuart's business dinners. I researched schools and managed the household accounts, and remembered which of his clients had dietary restrictions and which ones preferred scotch over rye. I was good at it. I was very good at it, and slowly that goodness became invisible. Stuart stopped mentioning my weaving. Then he started referring to it differently, as a hobby, as a phase, as something I had thankfully gotten out of my system. Once, maybe 15 years into our marriage, I mentioned I'd been thinking of taking a short course at the art college downtown. Just to stay current, I said. Just to keep my hands in it. Stuart looked up from his laptop. "Alice, we're not students anymore." That was all he said. I didn't bring it up again. By the time Gavin married Trina and they started joining us for Sunday dinners, the dynamic in our household was carved as deep as anything. Stuart spoke, and his opinions settled into the room like furniture. Mine were heard politely and then gently set aside. Trina was lovely in the way of someone who has learned very quickly which way the wind blows in a new family. She didn't openly agree with Stuart. Exactly. She just never disagreed. One Sunday, that previous spring, I had spent most of the afternoon preparing a roast, the slow kind, with root vegetables from the market and homemade bread to go alongside. Stuart and Gavin were talking in the living room when I carried the first dishes to the table. Stuart glanced toward the kitchen and said to Gavin, almost fondly, "Your mother would be completely lost if she ever had to function in the real world." Gavin laughed, not cruelly, just automatically, as though the joke was familiar enough to be harmless. I laughed too from the kitchen doorway, holding a serving dish with both hands. That is still the part that hurts most. By my 62nd year, I had become someone I didn't fully recognize. I existed in the margins of my own household, consulted when something needed doing, overlooked when something needed deciding. Stuart had grown very successful by then. There were investments, properties, a professional reputation that preceded him into every room. At neighborhood dinners and church socials, people said to me, "You must be so proud of him," as though his success were a weather event I happened to live near. And then one October evening, the kind of rain-soaked night that Victoria does so well, I found the envelope. I wasn't snooping. Stuart had asked me to pull a folder from his desk drawer, something to do with a dinner reservation he needed confirmed. And there, underneath a stack of correspondence, was a bank statement I had never seen before. The account was in Stuart's name, only. The balance was $280,000. I stood in his office for a long time. My hands were very still. I was aware of the kettle beginning to whistle in the kitchen, of the rain against the study window, of Gavin and Trina talking somewhere in the house. All ordinary sounds, all completely normal, and underneath them, the particular silence of a marriage rearranging itself. I put the statement back exactly where I had found it. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A retirement vehicle I hadn't known about. Something business-related. I was good at finding explanations. I had been practicing for 31 years. But once you start paying attention to someone who has been lying to you, you cannot stop. I noticed things I had explained away for years. Stuart taking calls in the garage with the door closed. Documents moved to a filing cabinet he told me contained only client materials. A second email address, glimpsed once on his laptop screen, and dismissed by me in the moment. Then came that dinner. Gavin and Trina arrived on a Saturday evening in early November. I had made lamb chops, roasted potatoes with rosemary, a cranberry galette for dessert. Stuart had been drinking since 5. When Stuart drank too much, he didn't become loud. He became precise. He chose words carefully, like a man selecting tools, and used them on the nearest available thing. Gavin mentioned rising housing costs in Victoria, just conversation. The way Canadians talk about real estate, the way others talk about the weather. Stuart leaned back in his chair. "Good thing someone in this family has always had a head for money," he said. He was looking at Gavin, but he meant the sentence for me. I said nothing. "Your mother would have bankrupted us by 1998 if I'd let her keep spending on those studio fees." He smiled at Gavin. Trina adjusted her cutlery. "I contributed to this household," I said quietly. Stuart looked genuinely surprised, then amused. "Alice," he said, "my name the way you say the name of someone who has made an endearing but foolish mistake. You haven't held down a real job in over 30 years. Gavin shifted in his chair. He did not say anything. "That doesn't mean I didn't work," I said. "Come on." Stuart picked up his wine. "You know what I mean." "I'd like to know what you mean." He set the glass down and looked at me across the table. Really looked at me, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to remind me of something without saying it plainly. "You wouldn't last 6 months without me. You know that." "Not maybe, not probably. 6 months, as though he had calculated it, as though he had sat with the specific arithmetic of my helplessness and worked out exactly how long I had." Trina cleared her throat. "The lamb is wonderful," she said. Gavin looked at his plate. I picked up my fork, and somewhere inside me, something that had been bending for 30 years finally became very, very straight. Trina found me in the kitchen afterward, while Gavin and Stuart watched the hockey game in the den. She stood in the doorway in the careful way she always stood in my kitchen. I was washing up, water running over my hands, and I didn't turn around. "He doesn't mean it personally," she said. "He said it very personally." She came a little closer then, in a lower voice. "He said things to people we know." She hesitated. "About you. About how you'd manage if something changed." I turned off the tap. "That you're not really capable. On your own." She said the words like she was handing me something fragile and wasn't sure I could hold it. "He told the Hendersons. You know the Hendersons from the golf club. He told them that if you two ever separated, you'd be back within a month." Her voice dropped further. "He says it like it's already settled." The dish I was holding was very cold from the water. I held it tighter. Stuart hadn't just been saying these things to me in private. He had been building a story about me for years, with our neighbors, with his clients, with people I smiled at over canapés at neighborhood events. He had been quietly establishing who I was, dependent, fragile, incapable of surviving outside the life he had constructed around me. And I realized, standing at my kitchen sink with cold water on my hands, that he had not been afraid I would leave. He had been certain I never could. I could not sleep that night. Stuart's breathing was steady and slow beside me. I lay awake, watching the ceiling fan turn, and thought about 31 years. At 3 a.m, I went downstairs. The house was very quiet in the way large houses are in the small hours. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, and then I pulled the bank statement from my coat pocket where I'd placed it the second time I found it, and I read it again. $280,000. By 8:30 the following morning, after Stuart had left for a site meeting in Langford, I drove downtown and sat in the parking lot outside a family law firm on Douglas Street. I sat there for 20 minutes before I went in. The lawyer's name was Vivian Trent. She was perhaps 50, with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that was at once brisk and very gentle. She listened to everything. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "You've been married 31 years, she said. "You left a professional career to raise a family and support your husband's work. Courts in British Columbia recognize unpaid labor within a marriage. What you contributed has value. Legal value." No one had said that to me in so long that I had to look away from her. "I need you to gather documents," Vivian said. "Every financial record you can access. Tax returns, property titles, investment statements. Do not confront him until we have a full picture. People who hide money often move it quickly once they know they are being watched." I drove home through the bare November trees, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, steadiness. Over the next 3 weeks, I became someone Stuart had never imagined me capable of being. I photographed documents while he showered. I copied files while he was on calls in the garage. I worked quietly and methodically, and I did not flinch when he walked into rooms unexpectedly. What I found was worse than one secret account. There were transfers, careful ones, spread across several years. Amounts that moved in ways designed to be boring, large enough to matter, small enough not to trigger obvious concern. And then, in a folder tucked inside a box labeled Tax Records, 2016, a property transfer document for a lot on the Sassnich Peninsula that I had co-inherited from Stuart's aunt 8 years ago. She had left it to both of us. I remembered signing something connected to it, years back. Apparently, that something had included a transfer of my portion entirely to Stuart. I did not remember agreeing to that. I did not remember signing it that way. I photographed every page. Vivian called me 4 days later. Her voice was level in the way that very serious things require. "I had a document specialist look at 3 of the signatures," she said. "The ones connected to the property transfers. They don't match your verified samples." A pause. "We believe your husband forged your signature on more than one occasion." I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs felt uncertain beneath me. Not just hidden money, not just a secret account. He had put his name on things that were mine by writing my name himself, because he had believed, with complete confidence, that I would never look. There are weeks in a life that change the shape of everything before and after them. The weeks after I found out about the signatures were those weeks for me. I moved through the house normally. I made dinner. I drove to the grocery store. I let Stuart assume he was winning. Because men who believe absolutely in their own certainty often stop watching the evidence. One afternoon, I went to the basement. I told myself I was looking for extra boxes, but some part of me knew what I was actually looking for. The loom was still there, still wrapped in its old bedsheet, still leaning against the wall behind the camping chairs and the boxes of Gavin's childhood things. I pulled the sheet back slowly. The wood was dusty. The heddles needed replacing. One of the tie-ups had come loose from its hook. I sat down on a folding chair and looked at it for a long time. Wrapped around one of the upper beams was a small bundle tied with kitchen twine. I had forgotten this was there. I loosened it carefully. Inside were threading drafts, pages and pages of them in my own handwriting, from before Gavin was born. Patterns I had designed myself, patterns I had copied from books, one very complicated overshot draft I had been working on the week. Stuart told me to dismantle the loom. Underneath the drafts was an envelope. My mother's handwriting on the front. She had died 6 years ago after a long illness. Losing her had felt like losing the last person who still remembered who I was before I became Mrs. Pemberton. I opened it carefully. Alice, her first word, just my name. I don't know when you'll find this, or why you've gone to the basement. Maybe you're looking for the loom. I hope you're looking for the loom. Your grandmother used to say that the women in our family are built for outlasting things. Not because life is easy for us. Because we know how to find the thread again, no matter how long it's been put away. You were always the brave one. Don't let anyone make you forget that. There is money in the account whose information is enclosed. I meant to tell you while I was still well enough to explain it properly. I am leaving it to you alone. Use it when you need it. Inside the envelope was a folded bank document, a trust account in my name only, $46,000, untouched for 6 years. I sat on the basement floor with my mother's letter in my lap and cried for nearly an hour. Not for the money, for the woman who had hidden it there, who had somehow known that one day I would need a door that my husband hadn't built. The first person I called was Bet Walsh. Bet and I had been close in our 30s, when she ran a fabric shop on the same block as my old studio. We had drifted apart the way you do, not a falling out, just the slow tide of different lives. The last time I had seen her was at a mutual friend's retirement party 7 years ago. I wasn't certain she would even answer. She answered on the second ring. An hour later, I was sitting across from her at a table in her shop, which had moved to a bigger space on Cook Street and was now the sort of place people drove from as far as Nanaimo to visit. Bolts of hand-woven fabric lined one wall. The air smelled like wool and cedar and a particular kind of order I remembered from my studio years. Bet looked at me for a long time after I finished talking. "How long?" she said. 31 years. She shook her head slowly, not with judgment, with something quieter than that. "Do you still weave?" she asked. I almost said I didn't know how anymore, that it had been too long, that the person who could do it had been packed away in a basement for 3 decades and likely couldn't be recovered. Instead, I said, "The loom is still downstairs." Bet stood up without another word and led me into the back of her shop. The workroom was warm. There was a large floor loom dressed and ready near the window, light falling across the warp threads in pale bands. Bet pulled a stool beside the loom bench and pointed at it. "Sit," she said. I sat. She handed me the end of a warp thread. My hands hesitated. For a moment, 31 years pressed down on them like weight. What if I had forgotten? What if Stuart had been right about everything I had spent so long trying to believe he wasn't? And then my fingers found the path through the heddles. The motion came back before the thinking did. I passed the shuttle through the shed, and my wrists rotated. Without instruction, the beater came forward, and the cloth grew by one thread. Bet sat very still. "There she is," she said quietly. I pretended not to understand what she meant, but I did. 3 weeks later, Bet gave me a corner of her shop to display work. I finished 4 pieces in that time. A table runner, 2 smaller wall panels, a scarf in linen and wool that surprised even me. Bet put them near the front window with a handwritten card that said "Handwoven by Alice Pemberton." The first person who bought something was a woman in her 70s who stood in front of the wall panels for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she turned. "Who made these?" "I did," I said, from behind the counter, where I had been trying to look as though I wasn't watching. She looked at me directly. "You have a gift," she said. Something shifted in my chest, not dramatically, just a small, quiet movement, like a door opening onto a room you had forgotten existed. Within a month, I had a waiting list for custom pieces. And then came the craft market. Victoria's Saturday market in Beacon Hill runs through November if the weather holds. Bet had a stall most weekends and offered me half of it. I brought 6 pieces, a portable display, and enough anxiety to fuel a small generator. I also brought, as it turned out, Stuart. He had not known I would be there. I don't know how he found out. Someone told someone. The way things travel in a city the size of Victoria. He arrived just after noon, wearing his good coat, moving through the market stalls with the particular gait of a man who is performing casualness. He stopped in front of my display. "Alice," the same tone as always, the one that contained a constant, gentle correction. Bet stood slightly to my left, the way someone stands when they are prepared to intervene. "What is all this?" Stuart picked up one of the smaller panels and held it the way you hold something you are about to put back. "This is what you've been doing." "Yes," I said. "You're selling?" He looked around at the other stalls. "Here." "Yes." He put the panel down and lowered his voice. "Alice, you have a lovely home, financial stability. You don't need to do this." "I'm not doing it because I need to," I said. "I'm doing it because I want to." Something moved across his face. Not anger yet. Something more like confusion. The confusion of a man hearing a sentence in a language he was certain his wife no longer spoke. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said. "Quiet enough that it was almost private. Almost." "I don't think so," I said. Stuart took a step closer. "You cannot support yourself on this. Whatever Betta has been telling you," he glanced at her. "She's filling your head with ideas that aren't realistic." "You seem very concerned," I said, "about what I can and can't do on my own." A beat of silence. Then he said, precisely, "You wouldn't last 6 months without my support. We both know that." I had been waiting for it, not consciously. But some part of me had known it was coming, had been standing quietly with it since the first time he'd said it across our dining room table. I didn't raise my voice. "I think you should go home, Stuart." "Alice, I think you should go." He looked at me for a long moment. I held his gaze without flinching, and then his expression changed. Not to anger, to something older and more private than anger, something I had never seen from him in 31 years. He left. 2 stalls down, a woman I had never met had her phone in her hand. She called me that evening. She had posted the last part of the exchange to a Victoria community group. By the time she called, it had been shared more than 1,000 times. I am not going to pretend I wasn't frightened by what came next. Attention is not the same as vindication, and kindness from strangers does not automatically fill 31 years of something more complicated. But the messages came. Orders came. A woman who ran a boutique in James Bay reached out about carrying my work. A retired art teacher in Sydney began driving in every Wednesday for the workshops I had tentatively started hosting from the back of Bettit's shop. 6 weeks after the market, a woman named Greta Harmon walked into the shop. I had heard of Greta Harmon. Most people in Victoria's business community had. She was in her late 60s, had built a small chain of boutique properties across the island, and was known for an approach to investment that people described, with a mixture of admiration and unease, as instinctive. She watched one of my Wednesday workshops from the back of the room without announcing herself and waited until the other women had gone. "How long have you been teaching?" she asked. "About 6 weeks." She looked at the loom. She looked at the large commission piece I was working on. A wall panel for a hotel on the harbor. "Have you considered a permanent studio?" she said. I laughed. An involuntary laugh, the kind that comes from the gap between what you have hoped for and what you have allowed yourself to believe is possible. "I've considered it constantly. I just don't know that I don't invest in projects," Greta said. I invest in people. She gestured, not at the loom, but at the room itself, at the space where the other women had just been standing. What you have here isn't a craft class. I think you already know that. I looked at the door they had gone out through. 3 had been through divorces in the past few years. 2 had come specifically because of the market video. 1 had driven from Sook every Wednesday because, she told me, it was the only hour of her week that belonged entirely to herself. Call me when you're ready, Greta said. She left a card on the work table. The legal proceedings with Stuart were not simple or quick. Vivian Trent was methodical and thoroughly unsurprised by each new document that surfaced. The forged signatures, the property transfer, the accounts, the careful financial architecture of a man who had spent years building an exit from a marriage while sleeping in the same bed as his wife. Gavin learned about the financial findings through Trina and called me on a Tuesday evening. He sat on the phone for 10 minutes before he spoke. "Mum," he said finally, "I'm sorry." Just that, 2 words. I thought about all the Sunday dinners. All the times he had laughed when he shouldn't have, or stayed quiet when he should have spoken. And I thought about how long it takes a person to unlearn the version of something they grew up believing was simply normal. You were his son, I said. That changes what feels true. It doesn't make it right. No, I agreed, it doesn't. He came to a Wednesday workshop the following week, sat in the back, said nothing, helped me carry the wool bins to storage afterward. Before he left, he stopped in the doorway. "People at my office are talking about your work," he said. "Apparently one of the partners bought a piece. She hasn't stopped mentioning it." I felt something I had not expected to feel in his presence. Ease. A quiet, uncomplicated ease. "Trina wants to come next week," he said. "If that's all right." It was more than all right. The studio opened on a Friday morning in March, in a renovated heritage building on Government Street, 2 blocks from the harbor. Greta Harmon had helped make it possible. Not as charity, she was explicit about that, but as a business arrangement she believed in. The space had tall windows, exposed brick, room for 6 looms in the main workroom, and a small gallery along one wall for finished pieces. The sign above the door read Thread and Rise. Bet arrived at 7 in the morning, with pastries from a bakery on Fort Street, and spent 40 minutes rearranging the welcome table before I could convince her it was already fine. Gavin and Trina came to help hang the gallery pieces. Greta stopped in briefly before 10 and looked around the room without saying much, which I had come to understand was her version of approval. By 11, the space was full. Women I knew and women I didn't. Customers who had ordered pieces online. 3 members of my Wednesday workshop who had been with me since the beginning. An older woman pressed both of my hands at the door and told me she had watched the market video 9 times and shown it to her daughter, who was trying to leave a difficult marriage in Kelowna. That undid me more than anything else that morning. Around midday, I looked up and saw Stuart standing outside the window, looking in at the studio, at the people, at the work on the walls. He was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, darker than his usual, less considered. He looked smaller through the glass than he ever had inside our house. I went to the door. We stood on the pavement together in the cold March air. The harbor was visible at the end of the block, flat and pale in the winter light. "This is real," Stuart said, not a question. "Yes." He looked at his shoes. "Gavin told me there are 6 workshops running now. 8 as of next month." He nodded slowly. The silence between us was not the silence of an argument paused. It was the silence of something that had genuinely ended. "There are some complications," he said finally, "with the investment properties. Deals I was counting on haven't gone through. There are tax implications I didn't anticipate." He stopped. "I may need to sell the house." I looked at him carefully. The house in Oak Bay, the greatest visible symbol of everything he had built and owned. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. He glanced toward the studio window. "I thought perhaps we could find some kind of arrangement." "Stuart," I said, "I'm not in a position to help you with your finances." "Alice, that's something you need to discuss with your lawyer." His jaw tightened. For a moment I saw the familiar shape of his irritation, The look that had, for 31 years, been enough to make me retreat and apologize and offer something to fill the space his displeasure left. I waited for the retreat to come. It didn't come. "You've changed," he said. "I've remembered," I said. "It's different." He looked at me for a long time, and then, quietly, the last of the certainty went out of his face. "I did believe," he said slowly, "that you couldn't manage on your own. I know. I think I needed you not to be able to." That honesty surprised me. It was the most truthful thing he had said to me in years, possibly ever, and I let it sit between us without filling the silence around it. "I hope things improve for you," I said, and I meant it. Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly, in the way you can mean something for a person you have entirely let go of. I went back inside. It has been 2 years since Thread and Rise opened. There are now 8 workshops running out of the Government Street studio, and a second location in Sydney, closer to the ferry terminal, which does well with summer visitors and with locals year-round. Bet serves on the advisory board. Greta comes to the annual show every December and says very little, which still means the same thing it always has. Gavin handles some of the financial administration, which he offered to do, and which I accepted on clearly written terms. Trina manages the apprenticeship program we started last autumn for women, over 50 re-entering the workforce after extended caregiving. That was her idea, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. Stuart sold the house. He lives somewhere in Saanich now, in something smaller. We don't speak often. When we do, there is a particular quality to the silences, not hostile, not warm, just honest in the way that things become after the performance finally ends. On a Friday afternoon in October, not long ago, I found myself standing alone in the studio after everyone had gone home. The looms were quiet. The gallery wall held a new collection. Pieces I was prouder of than anything I had made in my 20s. Outside, the Japanese maples along the block had turned entirely to gold, the way they do in Victoria in October, the leaves letting go easily, without making too much of it. I made tea and sat on the bench beside the largest loom and looked at the room. I thought about the woman I had been at that dining room table 2 years ago, holding a serving dish in both hands while the man she had given 31 years to explained, with the patience of someone correcting a simple error, that she would not survive without him. I thought about the loom in the basement, the threading drafts wrapped in kitchen twine, my mother's envelope. Then I picked up my shuttle and worked until the light faded, and the room smelled like wool and cedar, and something else I could not have named. Something that belonged entirely to no one but me. Stuart was right that I had changed. But change was never what he should have been afraid of. What he should have been afraid of was this. The moment I remembered that the woman I was before I became his wife had never actually disappeared. She had only been waiting, patient as a loom in a basement, for someone to finally find the thread again. If this story has stayed with you, please like and subscribe to Silent Tears Stories. And leave me a comment. I want to know. Have you ever had to rediscover a part of yourself that someone else convinced you was gone? Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I read every single one.